Hello everyone. I'm just going to take this time to talk about a recent event last week. The Federal Reserve Open Market Committee met and they basically made a change to monetary policy. Now, for some of you who are not familiar with this committee, the FOMC stands for the Federal Open Market Committee. And basically this is the committee that belongs to the Federal Reserve, our nation's central bank, that sets monetary policy. Basically, this is the most powerful group when it comes to macroeconomics in the world. And their job is to try to maintain low levels of unemployment and stable and low inflation. And right now, they're very concerned about high inflation in the economy. And this group, the FOMC, they meet about 8 times a year, and that's when they announce any changes to monetary policy. Now, they don't have to wait for a meeting to change monetary policy. They can make policy changes between meetings, but usually they wait for the meeting and then they make an announcement. And last week they did meet and they announced that they are raising short-term interest rates. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to read through their brief statement and take things piece by piece to try to make sense of it. So right up here, I'm at the Board of Governors website for the Federal Reserve, and I have their latest press release that they issued last week. So let's just take a look at it. So I'm going to read from the top here. So recent indicators point to a modest growth in spending and production. So basically what they're saying is that the economy is expanding, but not rapidly. Job gains have been robust in recent months, and the unemployment rate remains low. So let's take a look at that data to see what they're talking about. They're talking about the unemployment rate. So I'm going to go to the unemployment rate. So here we have the unemployment rate, and I've got it from 1950 all the way till right now. And you can see the current unemployment rate. If I put my little cursor right here, you could see in August 3.7%, and you could see historically that's very low. And you could see these little gray areas that you see here, those are periods where the economy was contracting, what we call recessions. And you can see we had a very brief recession during the COVID time, but it represented a very severe drop in economic activity, and as you see, the unemployment rate soared to a high of about 14.4%. The unemployment rate soared, and this caused a lot of concern, and the Federal Reserve as well as the federal government tried to stimulate the economy to try to get these unemployed workers back into the labor force, back to working. And it pretty much worked, because you could see the unemployment fell sharply, and you could see now the unemployment rate is back to where it was pre-COVID, pre-recession. And that's what the Federal Reserve was talking about in terms of the unemployment rate. The labor market is robust and the unemployment rate is very low. Now this is very strange, because usually you would associate an unemployment rate of 3.7% with an economy that's expanding rapidly. But the economy isn't expanding rapidly. It's expanding, but not rapidly, which is confusing a lot of people. So let's go back to the statement. Inflation remains elevated, reflecting supply and demand imbalances related to the pandemic, higher food and energy prices, and broader price pressures. So they're talking about inflation. Now there's many ways of measuring inflation. One of the most popular ones is the Consumer Price Index. That measures consumer inflation. So let's take a look at that data. So here I've got the Consumer Price Index. Now this is being measured on a year-over-year basis. So in other words, you could take September prices and divide it by September prices of last year. That percentage change is called year over year, and you could see that it's relatively high, and its last was measured at 8.25%. call it 8.3%. Now, historically, we haven't had inflation that high since back in 1982. So that historically is high in the United States, and you could see how it rapidly increased as we came out of the COVID lockdowns. Now, the United States is not the only country experiencing high inflation. It's basically worldwide, which is representing the global effect from the pandemic. But this is very concerning, and what the Federal Reserve is going to try to do is it's going to cool the economy down to bring down inflation. Now, what do we mean by cooling the economy down? So if I just do a simple supply and demand graph, so we've got prices here, that's the inflation rate, and we've got output right here. Now, if I just draw a nice little supply curve and a little demand curve. Now, let's say we start with a price level of P1. Oh, that's supposed to be a 1. Now, what could cause the price level to go up? Well, one of the things that did was the federal government and the Federal Reserve during those periods of high unemployment in 2020 tried to stimulate the economy. They stimulated the economy by the federal government basically giving stimulus money to the general public, and the Federal Reserve tried to stimulate the economy by engineering a drop in interest rates to increase borrowing, to increase spending. And that increased demand, and that caused a rightward shift of the demand curve. And it shifted this way. So if you shift the demand curve that way, you could see that we move from this price level right here, right here, to this equilibrium price level right here. So that represents an increase in inflation, P2. Now, we had a double whammy because not only did we have a rightward shift of the supply curve, right here, the supply curve, of the demand curve, we also had a leftward shift of the supply curve. Now, the leftward shift of the supply curve basically represents supply chain bottlenecks. What happened was, since coming out of COVID, a lot of factories were shut down because workers were being quarantined. This happened all around the world, and it was very difficult to get shipments to the end destination. And as a result, you see the supply curve shifted from here to here. So let's call it supply 2. And that meant we moved from this point right here, we had an increase, and we moved to an even higher inflation rate. So this is what the Federal Reserve was talking about when it was talking about price pressures, both in the food and energy and because of robust demand. So the other things that the Federal Reserve mentions is the Russian war against Ukraine is causing tremendous human and economic hardship. The war and related events are creating additional upward pressure on inflation and are weighing on global economic activity. What they're saying is that the leftward shift of the supply curve that I just mentioned is being exacerbated by the war in Ukraine because Ukraine is one of the primary growers of wheat. And that is causing food prices to go up because those shipments have been curtailed considerably. The other thing that's being caused by the war in Ukraine is a shutdown in energy shipments to Europe and other parts of the world in terms of oil and natural gas. And that's causing energy prices to go up. So the war in Ukraine is also having an effect on energy prices, which is feeding higher overall inflation rates. So let's take a look at the third paragraph. The committee seeks to achieve maximum employment and inflation at a 2% over the longer run. In the support of these goals, the committee decided to raise the target rate of the federal funds to 3 to 3.25% and anticipates that ongoing increases in the target range will be appropriate. So, but what they're doing is they're announcing that they're raising short-term interest rates. Now let's take a look at those short-term interest rates that they're referring to. So right here, I have two interest rates being tracked. One is called the Fed funds target rate, and the other one is called the IROB, interest on reserve balances. These are the interest rates the Federal Reserve is talking about. Now, the Federal Reserve mentioned in that tidbit federal funds target. Now, to be honest with you, I don't know why the Federal Reserve did that, because this is the old short-term interest rate they used to manipulate to try to raise overall interest rates, both short-term and long-term. But that interest rate is no longer the primary key short-term interest rate. It's the IORB rate, the interest rate on reserve balances. And that interest rate is in red, and the federal funds rate is in blue. You could see that they pretty much were change in lockstep. When one changes, the other changes. And right now, the interest rates are sitting at about 3.15 to 3.25%. Now, when these interest rates change, it has a ripple effect on other interest rates. Let's say a 5-year car loan rate or 30-year mortgage rate. And when those interest rates go up, it's more expensive to borrow. And when it's more expensive to borrow, people borrow less. When people borrow less, they spend less, and this cools the economy down. Hopefully, it's going to shift the demand curve over to the left a little bit, and it's going to cause overall inflation to drop. That's the hope. The danger is an overreaction to the raise in interest rates, meaning what if the housing market collapses as a result of higher interest rates because people can't afford to buy a home, because most people usually borrow money to buy a home. This is a danger. So there's fear that the economy may slow down too much and outright contract due to these raising interest rates. The hope is that the Federal Reserve just cools down the economy, not causes it to go into a deep freeze. And so these are the things that everybody is worried about. Now, in your econ classes, these are we go over topics that help you understand these very important issues that are in the news every single day. Now, hopefully, the things that we discussed in this little short video helps clarify things, and it causes you to learn more about what's happening around us. Please post your questions and comments for this video, and I look forward to interacting with you in the future.